Hello and welcome to episode number 431 of the Armin Show podcast. We have scientists, we have interviews, knowledge is coming through. It's 2024. My guest today is in the local region, Cal Poly Pomona, in the philosophy department there, and has her own show that is co-hosted. My guest today is Professor Gwendolyn Dolske. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
I am glad to have you on. You have your own show, which is super cool content creators in the world. You co-host it with Rudy Salo. It is called The Good Is in the Details podcast. I have a show, you have a show. How long have you been doing your show? How does it speak to you as a person? Which part of you comes through on that program?
Well, thank you for the question. It's been an absolute joy. It's been an absolute joy to create this show. And I had pitched Rudy on it, and Rudy is just a stunning and wonderful and very intelligent person. And I knew him in high school way back when. And then we connected via social media when I saw that he was doing a lot of things like doing some podcasting. And so I wanted to know if he'd be interested. But the genesis of this idea is that, yeah, my background is in philosophy, and the overwhelming majority of my students are not philosophy majors. So I teach classes where it'll be a general ed requirement. But I have consistently had really good interactions with my students over the years, and I've kept in touch with some of them, and they like to stay after class to talk about some of the ideas. So it's not the same thing as, let's say, what they would use in a job interview. Like, they're not going to walk into a job interview and talk about Aquinas, for instance, and the proofs for the existence of God. But questions like, does God exist, are things that stick with them, and they want to work out those ideas. Other questions that philosophy tackles. What is real? How do you know when you know something? What constitutes truth? And then there's a class called Philosophy of Sex and Love that I teach that everyone seems to very much enjoy because it's fun to talk about sex and love. And that also generates a lot of conversations, again, amongst non-philosophy majors. And so the idea behind the podcast, Good is in the Details, was to not gatekeep this university access to these big topics, that they're genuinely a joy. That a lot of times when we talk about happiness in life, how do we attain it? What does it mean to be happy? We will focus, and quite rightly, on things like physical and spiritual and emotional development. Rudy and I believe there's another pillar to that, and that is knowledge or intellectual growth. And so the dynamics of Good is in the Details is to open up questions that have a lot of different topics, but we use a philosophical lens for them so that by the time everyone finishes an episode, what we hope they get out of that episode is that they know more than when they started, and that they enjoyed the experience of learning about these topics.
I look heavily at the title of your show, Good is in the Details, and I look at nuance, specificity, ability to handle ambiguity. Detail-oriented nature is something that's very valuable, I think, in public discourse and for the growth of a society. Why is the good in the details? Why should a person look more in depth into something versus width on everything?
Yeah, well, I have to say that my friend's husband actually came up with the name of the show. We had been working on some ideas for a while, but I noticed that in philosophy, I mean, when I teach, that I seem to always come back to this question of what does it mean to enjoy your life? That was the big question that was driving all of my syllabi. And so this idea of, like you said, taking a more in-depth look, let's see what is going on. What are the definitions? What are the presuppositions? Are we making some errors in our judgment that is underscoring some bigger thing? And that it's kind of fun to pick apart the ideas that we think are normal and just say, wait a minute, where's the origin of this idea? Why do I have this concept in my head that this is the way things are supposed to be? And so that is where in philosophy, where we slow things down and try to say, wait a minute, what are the premises here? What are the steps? What are the assumptions? What are the connections? And that is a joyful experience. It's hard. don't get me wrong. I mean, it's challenging, but it's kind of like when somebody's at the gym and they're like lifting heavy weights and they're grunting and you're thinking to yourself, put that down. What are you doing? But they keep coming back to do it more. There is something about the challenge of stressing out your muscles or your mental muscles that make you stronger and more aware and just, yeah, enjoy your life more. So I always came back to that question. What does it mean to enjoy your life? Because in an American education system, we teach a lot of things, which I'm not against. Like we teach, literature, history. I wish we had more civics courses, but there's also some computer literacy. I mean, all, the sciences, things like that. But we don't teach people how to enjoy their lives. And that might sound like it's some sort of a, well, how do you come to some sort of a conclusion of what does that mean? Or how would you even go about teach that? Well, the greatest thinkers did give us some guidance on that. There are ways in which you can engage in the world, in your own experiences, in order to bring about that heightened sense of joy, the awe of being, the questioning, the curiosity, knowing that there is always more to learn is an exciting endeavor. And so, like I said, with all the classes, I mean, I taught a engineering ethics class for a while. And then there's philosophy of sex and love. And I've taught existentialism. And these things all seem so, so different. But for me, I kept coming back to how does reading this work, the lessons that we're learning, how does that translate into when I walk out of the classroom or I close the book, into having a more rewarding and fulfilling existence?
Makes sense. You're doing the practical, you're connecting what you read to the practical or the applicability of it. How can this lead to someone having a fulfilling time on earth while they are here? I like that you mentioned earlier putting in effort, grunt work like in the gym, or thought work in the mind, using our prefrontal cortex or other regions to really make an effort on a regular basis keeps us sharp. Whereas if we let that go for a long period of time, then 2 years later we haven't done heavy thinking, and now if someone asks us a question, I'm not sure. As I was mentioning there, we have the ability to put in a lot of mental effort, just as physical effort keeps us sharp over time. Mental effort can keep us sharp over time, and then if we put that in, then anytime there's a debate or a discussion, we're ready to go and contribute. Or if there's internet material, make content for the public in some way and be in the moment, versus if we're not staying on or trying critical thinking or testing out things that are maybe ambiguous or challenge us a bit, then we won't be ready for that future moment 6 months from now, 2 years from now, when we'll be called upon to be ourself. And so it says a lot to be there. And if we really are ourself a lot, we will be, like you mentioned earlier, Aquinas or some individual that is known for really being their self publicly with their thoughts and whatnot. It's a real statement. Speaking of philosophers, do any of them stand out to you the most? I remember a few people, like I remember one person who Aquinas was their favorite person. That was their nickname for like 10 years on the internet, on this online community. And I know somebody who likes Wittgenstein, and then somebody who likes Sisyphus, or the myth of Sisyphus, that writing. Are there any philosophers that speak to you or align with a worldview that you roll through the world with?
Yeah, it's so difficult to answer that question. And the reason is because philo means love and Sophie means wisdom. So, and if you earn a PhD, then you're a philosophy doctorate. So any field of study, if you study biology, if you study history, if you decide to engage in material for that long and contribute to the existing body of knowledge, you are a philosopher. And I would say that my interest in the great thinkers, there's times when I had become obsessed with a particular thinker or a particular work, and it was always kind of a reflection of where I was in my own life. So I think in the same way where somebody could really enjoy sports or could really enjoy music, that what they're into at the time also reflects maybe what they are going through. But I love the classics. I love Socrates. I open up every single semester with talking about Socrates' trial, the Apology. And it never gets old to talk about that. It's, to me, still such a stunning piece of literature. And it's one of my favorite things to introduce students to. And it's meant so much to me that that's the tagline for our podcast, For Good is in the Details. We'll say this is the podcast where we learn what we didn't know in the spirit of Socrates, because that's what Socrates was famous for. Just this oddity of a human being who wanted to pursue knowledge and to understand what wisdom meant. And in doing that, annoyed everybody in Athens, pretty much. Annoyed everybody. But it was just this quest of going out into the world and having this dialogue. And through that dialogue, you understand what your purpose is. And you also understand others. And I think that that's really beautiful, that growing does not necessarily mean a retreat from the world, but it's diving right into it and how much we learn about ourselves through conversation. So that's something I really enjoy about Socrates. And then I love the classics. Like I love reading Aquinas. I know that's not many people love reading Aquinas, but the depth of thought and the way that things are organized, it's stunning to me. And then the father of modern philosophy, Descartes. Every time I teach Descartes or I'm reading his work, I still kind of need to have a moment to myself and think, this is the man who invented analytic geometry. How does one even go about that? Or this person wanted to say, wait a minute, we've been assuming that the mind exists, this non-physical part of us. How do you prove that you have a mind? It's not something that we can use with any of our five senses to determine. Let's say you can prove that you have a mind. How do you prove that somebody else has a mind? And so these are just very fun ideas for me to engage with. I will say that in my 20s, I gravitated more towards existentialist thinkers like Simone de Beauvoir and Camus for The Myth of Sisyphus. And I really just fell in love with their work. And I think that as far as influence goes, they might be the biggest influence in how my day-to-day lives. I think about them when I think about analyzing current events, or what it is, how I reflect on my own life, or what I reflect on what I want for, let's say, my daughter's life. What kind of a role do I want to play in the world? So I think for me, Simone de Beauvoir and Camus would be once I read them, they're part of me now. I can't unsee it. I see the world through that lens.
Two things come to mind there. One clear one, I'll come back to Camus, but you mentioned how Socrates, putting out his knowledge, maybe annoyed some individuals. There was this one post or comment from Jeff Bezos about how long ago, if somebody was a knowledgeable person and mentioned too much, they were clubbed over the head by the rest of the community, because at that time it was just, you're saying too much and you're challenging things, and now knowledgeable people are okay in society and we're not clubbed over the head. How can someone be that where they are bringing a fair amount of knowledge to the public space, but they are not imposing on the public in some way where they're saying, oh no, here comes a knowledgeable person?
Yeah, I think that that's why understanding argument structures, and let's say if somebody's in the sciences, how to read data, is so important. And the other thing that's important is to know when, this is also something that wise people do, but know when to yield to somebody who knows more than you. And right now, I mean, one of the beautiful things about the internet is this ability for expression, and there's a lot of fun and freedom in that. But we have lost a sense of what does it mean to be an expert in something. We don't all have equal capacity for thinking. And I've noticed, and it's probably been in the last few years, even with my students, when they ask about writing a term paper for their philosophy class, it says, do you just want our opinion? Or it's just our beliefs? And it's a stunning, yeah, I mean, for me, I've been saying stunning a lot. It's a bizarre response. And because I just go ahead and put up on the board, okay, everybody, is there such a thing as a good thinker? Are all thinkers the same? And we have to sit back and I'm like, okay, what's the difference between a good thinker and somebody who's not that great of a thinker? Because there's something about this notion of opinion and belief that just because everybody has one, that then they're somehow all equal. And that's just not true. There's more depth with data, with research, or argument structure, like is something a red herring, or, to kind of weed out what doesn't follow, what are the fallacies. The more knowledgeable you are when it comes to things like fallacies or how to read statistics or data, then that will enhance your life, and you'll be less likely to be saying, hey, is that just your opinion or your belief? So I think that's one of the things that's definitely needed today. I just saw a prominent, uh, let's say, influencer, political type personality. And so I'm not going to mention any names, but this person just went on a rant about, oh, we're just supposed to believe the scientists. And I just thought, yes, yes, that's how science works. You have theories that are put forth with numbers and tests, and then other people test to come to some sort of an agreement. The fact that this very popular person was just saying things like we didn't land on the moon, and the vaccines are fake, and we're just supposed to this person has a very big platform and following, and it's a shame because that kind of attitude is really decreasing our capacity to be in awe of the world. That's what I think it is. That's something that's really tragic about it, because when you understand something, it can bring so much more life to the experience of it. And in the same way, when, let's say, you want to go travel, if you read up a bit about what it is that you want to visit, and then by the time you see it in person, it's amazing. So there is just really this anti-intellectualism, or it's called anti-elitism, anti-intellectualism. I also it pains me that people think that being thoughtful or wanting to think through some ideas, that somebody thinks that they're better than somebody else. I don't think knowledge should ever be that way. It's something that should be shared and should be fun and storytelling and things like that. So anybody who is quite bright or has studied a lot, if they're standoffish, I'm not really an advocate of that. I'm not an advocate of looking at people and just saying like, oh, how stupid are you? I'm an advocate of really, when you're dissecting and conversing about ideas, this is something that is enjoyable.
I agree on that point, where we want to give it the weight that it should have. If someone is putting in all the effort and thought, that's a lot of processing. They're doing it for maybe not just themselves, but the collective public. So to look at that and say, oh no, you're putting in effort, put in less effort and come join us not putting in effort mentally, so we can all be the same. Because even though it could be beneficial to the general public, I actually more valued this brief moment where I would prefer that we are on the same place versus you appear to be up here. But the point of the whole up here is that maybe it passes on to the collective, and then this will also come up over time.
Yeah, and the more that you learn, then the more respectful you are of other people's talents. I think when you develop your own talent, I'll just give a brief example. I really do not know very much about music. I'm a consumer and I like it and I listen to it all the time, but I'm not all that knowledgeable. And I remember just earlier in the year when Beyonce's album dropped and I listened to it, but I was also hearing from experts in music of the significance of some of the chords that she used, why she was singing in a particular way that she did, the structure of it, the order of the songs. I mean, these are things that I didn't know. And I was so fascinated and intrigued because what it was that I was enjoying on a surface level is just somebody who just wanted something in her ears while she went to go for a walk. Like that's my level of depth with music. But because I know what it takes to study history and to know the details, if you will, I was more fascinated by the people who do hold that expertise. And I was really grateful for that expertise because then the next time I listened to a song, I thought, oh, this is what she is doing. So that's where I think, when somebody's explaining something in science and medicine, engineering, when you have an appreciation for your own talents and what it takes to be good and exceptional in a space, you have a better capacity for relating and enjoying the company of somebody else and their knowledge.
There's something to be said for, I would always put out known figures. I always have this theme that if you know somebody's name, generally they can't be that lacking in understanding, because they would most likely be the leading figure of a whole group of individuals and have the most depth or some sort of understanding in that category, such that they got to that point. And then when you see the depth, you're like, oh, you put that song there in that order, and you put that chord represents something from 1840, and then you said this because of this, and that tells about that person. You included like 15 layers to it that people can find out 6 months later. That's a cool feature. That's what we find pretty enjoyable as people. If there was no depth in anything, our world would just be like, eat berry, found another berry, I don't know, eat a berry. That's about it. Like, we would be, or like a rabbit, and the rabbit eats kale. I mean, other stuff as well. But if that was just our whole existence, and we just ate kale and then ate kale, so that's lacking depth. But if there's layers of depth to things we make for others, they have a whole path to travel through. It's like making a mountain trail for their being to pass through, which is neat. Now, earlier you had mentioned Camus. I brought up Sisyphus, and then Camus, he is into absurdism. Are we in an absurd reality? Does this reality make sense? Is it funny at times? What are your thoughts on this world we exist in at this point?
Yeah, I think so. To back up, I come from a Catholic school upbringing, and so maybe that's probably why I didn't learn about the existentialists who were atheist or agnostic for a long time. And so going from that very strict Catholic education, which I enjoy and I appreciate, but I'm not a religious person, but I do appreciate the education and the foundation I was given. And I'm being introduced to the ideas of Camus and other atheistic thinkers like Nietzsche and Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre. And I was just so intrigued. I also really loved Kierkegaard's work, who's not in that class, but an existentialist thinker. And I just thought his descriptions about faith were so fascinating, and about love and the methodology of all the pseudonyms. But back to Camus and this idea of absurdity. There is something, for me, there was something kind of comforting about reading Camus. And it's that this whole history of philosophical thought and theology, that there must be some sort of an absolute truth. Be that God, or let's say Kant's categorical imperative, that there is an order to the universe. Or from Aquinas, there's this idea of a divine governance. There's an order to the world. And Camus rejects that. He rejects that things are ordered. And he says that everything that we do in our life is actually this attempt to instill order. And the reason we're always trying to instill order is because we know there isn't any. And so the only way that we can grasp things is to try to organize everything. Say, give you a checklist of life. By this age, you're supposed to do this. By this age, you're supposed to do that. But those rules aren't really written down anywhere. It's really how we communicate as a society. He even said when it came to fiction, when it came to literature, we turn to that, where there will be these nice and tidy endings and everything, everybody works out everything, that's an inherent rejection to escape from the way that the world actually is, that it's not tidy. It doesn't make sense. It's possible that it does from a God's eye view, but we don't know that. There's no way for us to know that. So don't be spending your life trying to chase after the order, because it doesn't exist, and it will actually decrease your capacity to enjoy your life. It will cause a lot of suffering. In some ways, that sounds very Buddhist to me, but it will cause a lot of suffering. So, for example, a loved one passes away unexpectedly, and you're saying they weren't supposed to, or that shouldn't have happened. But that language that we're using is only going to enhance the suffering, as though there is an order to things. Do people die young? Yes. Do bad people get away with doing things like they're never caught? Yes, that happens. We like to write about justice. We like to write about love because it all works out. But that is a completely disingenuous way of how we actually experience the world. And so Camus is coming up with literature to help us navigate that. And also he says you have to breathe with it. We're not supposed to fight it, but you kind of let go of that idea that there is a way that things are supposed to do, the way you're supposed to be, the way that things are supposed to go. And in that, you really discover the freedom of being able to enjoy your life, to not be tied to social norms that you did not create, that maybe don't work out for you, that maybe cause you a lot of stress, and just go ahead and enjoy your life. And so that's one of the things that I like about Camus. And yeah, the world is absurd. I mean, come on. Like, I mean, I can't even, I can't even, I sound like such a valley girl there. I
I can't
cannot,
even.
I know. I'm just, I have taken a hiatus from the news, not 100%, but I'll get a flash of the headline, and somebody posted something on TikTok the other day that just really hit me. He was an older gentleman. He says, "Can we just have 1 week of no major events?" Like, no, like I'm just exhausted. And you realize that you're just put into this machine for people to make a lot of money and to keep you addicted to every single thing that is happening. And everything is getting more and more outrageous because everybody's competing for that airspace, that time for your attention. And I have to just, like, as far as the absurdity goes, I have to just like turn it off, go for a walk, read a good novel. I can't even. It is an absurd world.
That's a funny point you bring up there. There is like a addiction machine going on, and I've always taken note of it somewhat externally because it doesn't really hit me. So then I know where it's affecting other people. So for me, it doesn't directly affect me, but it annoys me because I see it. I'm like, wait a minute, this is boom. You just knocked out 18,000 people right there and 4,000 people right there because they're caught up in this cycle, and then you're taking out our fellow people, And so that limits the movement and flow of society in a way. How does one, I sometimes discuss, but how does one counter the addictive nature of every methodology that's being put out today
I
strategically
think,
by companies?
yeah, how do we get rid of that addictive nature to like our social
hmm
media and the news?
I am just scrolling. I can't stop scrolling.
I know it's hard. This is what I do. I practice. I do not look at my phone first thing in the morning. I do something other than look at my phone first thing in the morning. And I encourage my students to do this. I actually made them do a 1 week trial to see who could last, and only a couple of students lasted 3 days. But the reason behind it is that when you wake up first thing in the morning, you're going to want to put your mind in some sort of tone of how you want to enjoy your day. But if you look at your phone, the first thing you're doing is you're saying what people need of you, or what other people are doing, or what other people think of you. And then you get sucked into that. So if you're answering emails as soon as you wake up, you're in a passive state where you're answering to other people's needs. And then if you're on social media, you're looking at, oh, here's the pretty pictures of those other people. This is what they're doing. Or maybe you're checking social media to see your notifications. You posted something and you want to know, did people like it? All of those things are the first thing to start your day. And it has nothing to do with you. Has nothing to do with what you want out of the day. It's your life. And your life can never be governed by what other people are doing or what other people think of you. If it is, that's depression. That's where you're heading for. And so I try to encourage my students, and it is a tough habit to break. But that's something that I do. I go for a walk. I'll tend to my daughter. Maybe it'll be something like I'll just do a couple of yoga poses and that's it. I don't care what it is. It just has to be something for yourself before you start tending to other people. That's what I think about getting out of the craziness.
Highly important message there. Reactivity versus activity. One of them tells you that the world is more important than you and reminds you that repeatedly. By the time you've accepted it, now you're depressed, as you described, because you didn't need to be there. It was just the outside was, you could have been, you're in the audience and anything could have come at you. And then when there's activity and you started from the day, boom, it's the world. You are the world at that point. And then you act outward. And then later on, it's not like those notifications or things would have changed that much.
Yeah.
And the amount of weight you put on them.
And this would be an example from Aristotle, where there was this idea of what constitutes happiness. And he's very clear, and I think he was right, that happiness is not the genuine happiness, or the ancient Greek idea of eudaimonia, which is intellectual growth and flourishing. It's an activity of the mind. So it's not some sort of a subjective state. It doesn't really have to do with the body. It has to do with the mind, the thing that makes us uniquely human. When you pay attention to that, that is the key to happiness. And one of the things he's very clear, and he says happiness is not dependent. It is self-sufficient. And what he means by that is that if you're pursuing fame, for instance, as happiness, it will never get you there, because fame is completely contingent on what other people think of you. It is not self-sufficient. But on the other hand, if you enjoy a good podcast, go for a walk, that's self-sufficient. That's for you. Nobody can take it from you. If you enjoy reading books, or you go travel, you go see somewhere new, or you go and have a coffee with a friend and you just laugh. Even if your home burned down after that, nobody could take that from you. It's yours. But if you put all of your joy and your happiness and what other people think of you, like how many likes did you get on social media or in possessions, and your home burns down, you are screwed. You are in a lot of trouble, because that's not going to sustain you. So it's one of those things that I think we need to be more mindful of, that happiness is not some sort of an emotion, an elusive, subjective state, but we have wisdom from ancient Greek thinkers. And we have psychologists today who are saying, hey, these are the steps. Please take them. But the addiction is hard. It's the potato chips. Social media is like the potato chips, right? Like you can't just have one. You just keep scrolling. Right.
It's pretty good. It's just difficult with potato chips. We know this. Classic. One thing I thought of while you were saying that is that the individuals that come across as selfish are more likely to have been in the reactive state early in their day or through their day, such that now they are depleted, depressed, if you will, and now they're grabbing at anything to make it through the day, which then comes across as selfish at that point, because they were not self-oriented earlier in the day to take things from themselves, represent for the world that they are, the person that they are while they're here, and then you have to either be self for yourself early, like in the day or in your patterns, or you're going to be selfish, pulling from other people later on just to make it through, because you have none of your internal drive fueling you, is what I think.
I have so much more energy if I start the day reading or writing or going for a walk. I have so much more energy throughout the day. I mean, I'm not perfect. It's not like I do that every day. There are days where it's like, I'll just scroll. Let me just see what happened. And then an hour can go by, and I never have the same energy throughout the day. But I also notice that when I post on social media, that I always post at the worst time. It's like 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. And it's because I'm not thinking. It's like I'll do it. Like we'll do an episode of Good is in the Details, and I'll be like, I should really promote this. Let people know we did something. And it's the last thing I do, because the rest of the day is filled up with these tasks of like trying to figure out, wait a minute, what do I want out of life? Who do I want to spend my time with today? And then the social media posts, again, they won't get as much traction because they're posted at the wrong time. But I don't want to be on the phone during the day. Those precious times when I could be spending with, friends, family, or doing work.
It makes me think of the inverted nature of this. Like Justin Bieber's story when he started was that he put out music to friends and family. He was already good, and I'm just putting it on YouTube, see what happens. And then the person that's like, it's like the person that karaoke that really wants to be on stage. People are like, and then there's a person in the back that's like, I don't know. I don't know. People like put them on stage. So same thing with you're doing your stuff, and then the content is after effect versus you're not really doing your stuff, and then you want to make up for it with a grand expression. That never works.
Hmm.
So it's you can't lose when you do your thing because you get win there and then you win there, and then if you don't do your thing you lose there, and then you go out into the world depleted looking for an accolade, and now you lose. It's like a lose-lose. It kind of guides us in one direction. Do you notice that philosophers represent a certain life message in different ways, kind of like religions represent a certain life message in different ways? Do you ever see like themes across philosophers where like you're saying the same
Hmm.
things but like with a spiritual sense to it or with a logical sense to it or like that?
Yeah, there's the philosopher Karl Jaspers, and he wrote a book, and I always get the order wrong. I think it's Socrates, Buddha, Jesus, Confucius. And it's actually more like a long essay than a book because it's only around 90 pages. But where he does a comparative study of what is it behind these four great men. And I also think it's a great introduction to philosophy because it's not theory heavy, but most people are familiar with at least two of those four names. And I really like the work that Jaspers did in putting it together because it you kind of you get to see these character traits that the greatest minds and influential minds, what did they have in common? And to kind of like zero in on that, what's happening there? But there will be different angles as well. I really like the philosopher Mary Wollstonecraft. I became intrigued by her. I had to discover on my own because philosophy is a male dominated field. Nothing wrong with men. Men are lovely, but there really are not any, I mean, I want to say I was finishing up my master's when I asked one of my professors if there was such a thing as a woman philosopher, that it didn't even occur to me because we hadn't read any in any of my classes in undergrad. Yeah, I can't think of any. And then he introduced me to the work of Hannah Arendt, and I really really liked her. And I was just intrigued for initially because hey, this is a woman philosopher. Do they write differently? Do they think differently? And then another thinker I became intrigued by was Simone de Beauvoir, and then Mary Wollstonecraft is somebody who's flown under the radar, and it's because she died when she was in her early 30s, and she was writing in the late 1700s. And I was telling my students, I say, you might not have heard of Mary Wollstonecraft, but you've heard of her daughter, and her daughter is credited with inventing the genre of science fiction, and her name also was Mary. And this is Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein. But Mary Wollstonecraft, I really enjoy, and this will get to your question about similarities, where in the 1700s, Mary Wollstonecraft was arguing that women should have an opportunity for education, that to deny women that opportunity to learn and to study is denying them happiness, that it's wrong. And then she kind of goes through, why is it that we don't allow women to have an education? Why do we want to say that women who are obedient are virtuous when that's completely contrary to what it means to be virtuous? Virtuous means independent and rational thinking. So you can't have a virtuous woman who's obedient. Those are mutually exclusive ideas. And I just loved the way that she tackled a lot of assumptions about women, that they are weak, that they are only good if they're following rules. They're essentially subhuman. And it makes sense when she was writing this because there was this upheaval in the West. You have the American Revolution and the French Revolution. You have people standing up and saying, hey, we can govern ourselves. Stop telling us what to do. So in that same time frame, this woman is coming along and saying women should be able to think for themselves. Now, not much came of this work. Like I said, she died in her early 30s, and the women thinkers were not really looked at in the same way. 100 years later, you have the very famous, one of the most important thinkers in philosophy, John Stuart Mill, and he co-authored a book with his wife called On the Subjection of Women, and it is tackling the issues that Wollstonecraft had pointed out 100 years before. He's not robbing. He's not, I don't want to make it sound like he's stealing or copycatting. He wasn't, but it was tackling this issue of women's place in society and that it is wrong. His angle was that it is wrong to legally prevent a woman from actively being able to choose where she wants to place her talents, to contribute to society, to legally bar her from doing that. And he asked this question, but why would you do that? What are the arguments for not allowing women to participate in society and do what they want? And one of the arguments is that women are naturally inferior. And so in the same way that Mary Wollstonecraft was tackling these ideas of natural inferiority, John Stuart Mill also tackled them to show that they were inherently problematic assumptions, that women, because they tend to be generally smaller, that translates into not being able to think very well. It's things like that. So that is from, let's say, the 1780s, Wollstonecraft. 100 years later, you've got John Stuart Mill in England. And then less than 100 years later, you have the novella, The Stepford Wives in the United States. And it's such an interesting novella because it's also tackling this issue of women's role in society. And it is making fun of, so it's a different way of tackling this. It's through literature, but it's making fun of the idea that women just exist to serve other people, that they are not human. Because in this town of Stepford, it's not possible to be a human and a wife. You can only be one or the other. And that's part of it. It's also kind of like a horror flick. But 100 years apart, it seems like we've got people coming around and saying, hey, look, these are ridiculous assumptions that women are just all some sort of one lump subhuman type of being. And it was approached in 3 different angles, all getting to the same message. And I think that's really fascinating too.
Sometimes there's like a baton handoff from a past person. I see that for different philosophers or even chefs or different. There's like lines from the past to the current, from similar personality type and thinking type individual onto the next in a way. What would I need to include more controversial? What are some controversial takes you have in relation to women and men or the roles people have? We need more controversy on the program. I don't have enough.
No, you know what? I don't. I won't think that something is controversial because I'm so steeped in the literature that it's not until I say it to somebody outside of a university system or like around normal people that I realize I'm saying something that is bizarre. I'm trying to think of something that I think is really controversial. I think I know a lot of people, the boomer generation, if you will, and I'm not picking on boomers, but they are not really understanding this hesitancy with Gen Z or younger millennials not wanting to get married. And one of the things, so I don't know if this is controversial, but it
Controversy
is.
alert, controversy alert.
Yeah, it's like,
No, I'm joking, I'm joking.
one of the things is that, and that's hard to explain to a boomer, is that it's simply just not a necessity, and it's actually a huge expense and a liability, and it's just not the same. So I'll just kind of go back into history, which I didn't think this was controversial. To me, I was thinking this just makes sense. But or when people who are more conservative leaning, socially conservative leaning, start to talk about like, oh, what are all these gay people, their march, their prides, how many different letters are we adding to this, the LGBTQ plus, and we didn't have that in my day. Well, I just say, because for a long time, marriage was essentially an economic agreement. And so your attraction or the way in which you were attracted to somebody was not relevant for a successful marriage. And I know that sounds very bizarre, but it's just that a marriage was really a contract between 2 parties, 2 families, for growth, for stability and growth. And a man would need that because if you want to climb the corporate ladder or be successful, you need that unpaid labor at home. You need a wife. If you're attracted to her, it's not really relevant. That's what you need. You need that unpaid labor. And then if you're a woman, you can't have your own bank account, your own business. You need to be married for your economic survival. That is your income. So you need that. And then what happened in the late 60s and 70s is that laws were passed in the United States that alleviated people of that financial need. So you have Title IX that comes out in the 70s, which means that women can become athletes and there needs to be funding for something like that. So all of a sudden, girls after school are not rushing to worry about what their boyfriends think about them. They're wondering, am I going to win a game? How well am I going to play? They're starting to be goal oriented on what they can do. And then that opens up university possibilities. That opens up career possibilities. So they are no longer defined by a marriage status and they no longer need it for financial security. Men also, turns out that they can do dishes and do laundry. They don't need that unpaid labor in order to survive. Men can do these things too. So what I think happened is that by removing that economic need, it gave the space for marriage and for relationships to be built on similar values, interests, desire, attraction. And so what wasn't relevant before, like as far as your level, let's just say with, trans to bisexuality to pansexual, like those things now are actually relevant because there's the space to express that, to figure that out. But before, it just wasn't, people were that way in private, I think, more. So it seems to be a bit more open. Now, this is apparently a controversial take. And one of the things for me is that I never want to come across as though I'm anti-relationship, anti-commitment, friendship, I'm anti-love, by suggesting that marriage is not of the same value as it was before, or that it's just not necessary anymore. I think when people hear that, they think that it translates into I would criticize somebody for wanting to be married, or I don't value that type of relationship. Nothing could be further from the truth. But it's just that what we're learning is that there's a variety of ways to exist when it comes to sexuality, when it comes to love, when it comes to attraction. And there's no harm. There's actually a lot of, like, suicide rates have gone down. As soon as women were allowed to get divorced, as soon as no-fault divorce came into being, which essentially meant that you could exit a marriage without needing to prove that the other person did something wrong. You could simply leave because you didn't want to be there anymore. Suicide rates amongst women went down. And we even see now that among the youth, the LGBTQ plus youth, that in states where there are fewer restrictions or there's less bigotry, that there's more happiness. The suicide rates are higher in areas of the United States where you have stricter laws about what can and cannot be said, or there's not as much legal protection if you're being bullied in that manner. So I think a lot of it is relative, but I think as far as controversial take is this suggestion that men and women don't necessarily have to have this institution that's been part of our life, and to choose not to be part of that doesn't mean you're anti-society or you're bad or anything like that. That it just might not be the way. And that's just an unheard of concept for a lot of people who are boomers, I think. Was that controversial? Does that sound controversial? I don't know.
Only if I say controversy alert, controversy alert. Now it's controversial. It has to be labeled in some way. I didn't do the label. It has, so there's a lot of parts there. What would be when is the best time for, or when is the best decade for women as far as fulfillment and well-being?
Oh, that's a good question.
That comes to mind. I'm so good at
it's a hard one. I'll tell you this. That's a really good question. It is a hard one to answer. And the reason is because rights and freedom and more openness toward women that the trajectory has been different based on either ethnicity or race, or maybe even first religious expression. So for white women, my my tribe, if you will, that things the ball got rolling for freedom and rights a lot faster than it did for Black women, for instance. So it would be, it would be disingenuous for me to be like, hey, everything was great when women got all of these rights. But if I were to do that, then I would not be honoring the path of, let's say, Black women. Same thing with Indigenous women that I know in the United States and in Canada, that the trajectory for their freedom, for their recognition, for their safety is on a trajectory that is far slower, I think, than any other group. I think. I'm not entirely sure. So it's hard to say what is the best because there's all those layers that we have to take into consideration. Now, I do think that I know that like the more that I read in the last 10 years by, let's say, women of color to learn more about their experiences, their fights, what they care about, I want to say things are more exciting in the last 10 years for women. But I mean, I just see a lot more recognition and contribution and a lot more women getting, finding how to navigate that age old question about family and balance and work, and that more and more mentors are around to help out women. So I think now there's a lot of opportunities that are out there that are really, really fun to see. It's like nice. Like I can even see with my own students, they're strong. They're not the young women in the classroom, they're not sheepish. Like from raising their hand and saying what they think, there's no problem there. And I've noticed that there has been a real shift. And this is something that I wish hadn't been at the expense of young men, but somehow it was at the expense of young men. I think that somehow is that the worst thing for young men, what they're taught from when they're young, is to be feminine in any capacity. And then what has happened in education is that once more opportunities were opened, like Title IX and women going to university and starting their career, where those women, those Gen X women, have had their kids. And so now you have, and the millennials have had their kids. And so those kids are now going through where everything feels possible. It's stressful, but they're not going to stop. But because young women are excelling in school now, maybe it seems feminine. And that's why young men are more likely to talk out of turn or to drop or to just say, screw this, I'm going to go do something on my own. Bill Gates built his empire on his own. It's like, but you're not Bill Gates, let's be honest. But there's there's some sort of a rejection of education now for young men. And I guess we're going to have to figure out more about the studies on that. But it should never have been that women excel, young women, girls and young women excel at the expense of men. Now, more conservative leaning positions will say that it's because we're trying to feminize boys, talk about their feelings and empathy. And I don't know that that's the case, but there's a part of me that suspects that when you start to see the Hermiones of the world, from Harry Potter, you're starting to see the Hermiones, and that is starting to be feminine. But when Hermione, the character, the charm of her is that she wasn't acting typically feminine. She didn't care about anything other than learning, which had typically been a masculine endeavor. And now the wonderful, charming thing about Hermione is this curiosity and desire for knowledge. And she's the smart one. She's the young girl. She's the smart one. And there's been this shift in the culture from that. And I'm seeing that more and more, like from the days of I Love Lucy, which I loved. But think about it, Lucille Ball was the powerhouse behind all that. She was the one in charge. but for the sake of the show to work, she had to look like she wasn't in charge. And that's what was funny, because she stepped outside of all sorts of gender roles. She would blacken out her teeth, look ridiculous, throw her body into the joke. That's just not something that women did. And but behind the scenes, she was the one who was in charge. But she portrayed somebody who was always having to be put in line by Ricky. How do we get from there to all of a sudden now the smart kids, that's the girls. The girls are in charge. I'm trying to think of other shows where I've seen that. Katniss from Hunger Games. She's the hero. The young women, more cop shows where the women are in charge and they're the cops. And we're seeing that reflected now where, like, to sit down and study or enjoy a book or try to analyze art or literature is somehow a feminine endeavor. But if you were to take any, let's say, art class, the first thing you're going to do is learn a list of men who are the famous sculptors and artists and architects. And somehow that is a more feminine thing. I don't know.
A lot of important topics right there. There's a shift to. There's quite a lot of shift that has happened. Earlier, you brought up young men and the impact. It's interesting what's the taking place in the last 15 years or so is a substantial shift, and I'm always ahead in society, like about 10 years ahead. So I was looking to help people I knew or men that were not the fulfilled in their own way too early. So by the time I was like, this is not working, then society starts doing that more recently in a more public fashion. So darn me being ahead of the curve here. But there is this where, right, the Hermione example is great, or like Katniss, there's that. And then what impact does that have on, I do a lot of socializing in public, for example, and because have like a very, I don't know, strong force or something, nothing affects me. So I'm doing fine generations from now, yesterday, before. But when I see other guys, I see like missed opportunities, and it's not going to happen here, and pieces are missing. So the wave is not for them as of recently. What happens? What does the wave look like in the next, let's say, decade for men and women? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think this would be something that, like, when I say I look at the world and I see, I'm so influenced by Simone de Beauvoir, but something that was, very big in her tackling this issue, from Mary Wollstonecraft to John Stuart Mill to Simone de Beauvoir, is this idea of, they're challenging the idea of human nature, and that making it gender specific, that a lot of the things that make us human are what we all have in common. We're not nearly as different based on ideas of what it means to be feminine and masculine. And so I think that the men are going to come back and be just fine. I think that they will, because it's not like, you can see how disingenuous it is to think for so long that thinking was just a masculine thing. No, it's a human endeavor. It's problem solving is fun for human beings. So just because women are enjoying that now and getting engaged in it, it doesn't all of a sudden mean that, oh, it's a feminine thing. No, it's still just a human thing. So the young men have to get back on board with it. But two radically different contemporary cultural voices. I mean, I don't think you could get more different on them. One is, she's a journalist, and her name is Liz Plank, and she wrote a book called For the Love of Men. And so her work is all addressing this issue of what is going on with men's violence, men's depression, men falling behind in education, and she is addressing it. There is an extremely conservative congressman from Missouri. Like, you cannot get, he is top tier conservative. Absolutely. And he wrote a book, oh my gosh, it's on the same topic about men. And just because I'm a curious person, I got both of them on audiobook, and I was listening to them, and I was taken aback at how many times they overlapped. You cannot have two more different people thinking about this. What they mainly disagreed on was the causal factor. So, but the expression, the effect of young men's behavior, they were spot on. They completely agreed, and wanted to highlight it as a problem. But what they thought was the causal factor was very, very different. So Liz Plank, the left-leaning journalist, is citing patriarchal ideas that she thinks are contributing and hurting men. This idea of competition, being on top, like it's just, or that women are prizes that you're supposed to own, that it's actually harming their and not showing emotions, that structure is what is causing the harm. Hawley, who is the conservative senator from Missouri, he blames liberal ideas are feminizing young men, and then that's why you have a crisis with young men. So they are radically different in what I think, the way they set up the problem, but they are remarkably similar on describing the problem. The things that they point out is, it was amazing to me. And I didn't quite expect that, but that would be another example where people are on the same page. And I'm glad that I got both of those angles, so I have an idea. But I know, as somebody in the classroom, I want for all of my students to succeed and to enjoy themselves. It is the young women have a different posture. They are more likely to sit in class, put the technology away, and listen and ask questions, and also want more detail on what should be expected of them for exams. And the young men, it's almost as though they want to be cool, and they'll have nothing on their desk, and they'll just kind of sit back while I talk. Yeah. And they don't do well because they don't take any notes. Like, they don't do as well. And I'm like, hey, look, let me help you out. But I don't understand how doing this when somebody's giving, like, how did that shift to that's the cool thing? But oh well, I think it has nothing to do with men or women being inherently able to tackle logic and thinking. It's 100% cultural, and it needs a course correction, like, immediately. I don't want to use my, just because I'm a feminist, it doesn't mean that I'm like, I want to say goodbye to the dudes. I'm like, come on, like, step up. Historically, you guys have had this. This is your thing. Like, even for something like philosophy, it's all men. It's all men that we're reading. There's still less than a quarter of the PhDs with philosophy PhDs are women. So it's still a masculine thing. But I think that because I'm the one who walks into the classroom and I'm their first encounter with somebody who has a PhD in philosophy, they assume that it's a feminine thing, and so they don't have to take notes, and they can just sit there like this.
This is great. This is my new intro.
Yeah.
I'm just back here in the corner. I thought, well, quite a few topics come. Well, yeah, being the cool factor. I have to comment on that because I always used to comment on that. Cool always comes with a loss. I figured out over life. Whenever you do something that is cool means some sort of not long-term view every time I ever looked at it. So I avoid cool big time because you pay for it later on every single time. Cool is always like, okay, let's say you do that thing in class. I don't know, it might be cool or maybe unattentive, but now you're not part of the thing. You're not in the space. You're not on at that moment. You missed part of the moment, for example. It's not good 4 months later. Usually cool things have that feature. Sometimes in cool, like athletics, has a risk of like you might not make it. Cool always has a more of a short-term element associated with it. So it's like mortgaging the future for your today. But I guess it looks cool for a brief moment, which is funny. That's a good one. That's fine to see the dynamics, the differences. I've seen there's statistics on like young men becoming more in the U.S. I don't know if this is any state, but like becoming more conservative, young women becoming more liberal. Is that connected in some way? Do you see any of these trends happening?
Yeah, there's been a trend, and there's some studies on that where young men are gravitating to this material that's put out by people like Andrew Tate, just really, really misogynistic material that's, I mean, I don't know. It's one of those things where um, I want my students to be happy. I want them to enjoy their lives. And I always tell them, like, if you're particularly religious, then date somebody who has the same faith as you. It's easy. Don't go out with somebody who's not the same and then criticize them for that. Like, but it's the same thing. Like, if you are traditional, if the man wants to be the breadwinner and the woman's going to have children and she's going to take care of everything at home, then, you want to be with people who fit that. So I always encourage them to be with whoever, whatever fits. But this material of really, there seems to be this real hatred of women who are successful. And that has to be, as though they're not supposed to be successful. That worries me. Well,
This that you brought up right there, the matching of values, how important is that? Because I've come into examples with this in my own self in recent years. If there is a disconnect, is it going to show up later, like religious and non-religious, or could be like family values, or if these
yeah,
things don't match up, is it just a ticking time bomb to like
yeah,
a future problem?
I think so. I think so. It really does. It really does depend. And people of different religions, of course, can make wonderful, wonderful, loving couples. It depends on the degree to which they are invested, in that, and to which the degree that the other person respects that. Then it's completely up to them. But yeah, but if it bothers you, then that's a very big that's a very big issue. I was with somebody for a very long time when I was younger. And one of the biggest value differences in us that didn't seem that big, but then became huge, was being curious, being wanting to try new things, go to new places, talk to new people, new restaurants. And there are people who just are not invested in that or interested in that at all. Totally fine. But then there's people like me who I'm like, I have the itch to pick up and go somewhere new and somewhere different. And I have to be with somebody who wants to do those same things, or at least doesn't complain about it. But that would be a value, because that's all about, like, wait a minute, life is short. How do you want to spend it? Now, from that person's point of view, it would be like, why would I be picking up and going all over the place when I've got a home? So it's like, you need to be with somebody who has that same value, who thinks that it's absurd to go everywhere. But for me, I'm like, I have to go up and see. I think life is short, so I want to see as much as I possibly can and engage as much as I possibly can. So it eventually, I guess that was one of the questions. I think that eventually comes up, those core values, if you overlook them. And a lot of times you find out a hard way. It's hard. Like, some person is a spender and some person is a saver. That can work, but you have to keep in mind that money, the way you spend money, is indicative of how you see your present, how you see your future. And so you're going to want to align those, and you can see that there will be differences, but you should be close in alignment, to how that's going to work out. Because if you're a saver and somebody's a spender, you have very different ideas about how you see the trajectory of your lives in 20 years. If you're the saver, you see that trajectory. The spender does not. And so you have to have a conversation about that.
That's a clear difference. And it's a good point you bring up that if the thing can be handled by the other person, or it's not like a big bother, that's the difference. Like, let's say you really want to explore and they don't, and that'll bug you daily, and they will not even barely notice it on their end. That'll start to pile up, because now, okay, we're missing this exploration. We could have tried this thing, now this thing. Now there's like 54 things, and you're not really, this is not affecting you. I'm being affected pretty substantially. So it's like you're paying a huge tax, and the other person can never fully acknowledge it the way you do, because they don't have that same interest. So you either have to, cut that short, or I guess find some deviation from something. But if it's really a big part of you, then that's a big deviation from your natural self, and they'll never know it because they're not that. That's something. And then the other point I wanted to bring up is, because a relationship topic is always super interesting to me. I look at it when I always look at it in big detail. Do you look at relationships as like past ones? Oh, I learned these few things from this person. I learned these few things from this person. Do we associate certain learnings with each past person? I definitely do that. What are your thoughts on that?
Do I wait, do I look at relationships as what I've learned from the person or
Like when I think of people I've been in relationships with, I think of like, oh, these core things I pieced together through that. It would not have happened without that.
mm,
And then onward. Do you have that kind of
yeah.
perspective?
I mean, even, even the trials that you can have in relationships ending is there's a lot to learn. There are some painful lessons. Sometimes you learn about yourself. Sometimes you learn about, oh, I was okay with something for a long time. Why was I okay with this? That was really hurtful. But you also, yeah, learn how to grow, how to laugh. I remember like I had a boyfriend in graduate school for a long time, and we came from very different worlds. And I'm still to this day very grateful about that relationship because there is so much that I learned by the way in which he interacted and the way, and he had a wonderful family. And I wouldn't change that for anything, I wouldn't change that at all. I know that my partner right now that I also just learn a lot from him. Just we have really different life experiences, and it's a joy to kind of see like how he and his family navigate things in the world. What are valuable to them? What are family lessons from them? And it's different for me, but it's all very, very special and very fun. And I think another thing that relationships, and this has to do with friendships, this isn't just a romantic thing, but life is hard and life is scary, and we tend to want to stay in our comfort zones. And I think that really good relationships give you the security to go outside of your comfort zone for that strength, for that courage. I've heard that that's a saying like courage comes from leaving your comfort zone. And I think about times when I've left mine, and it's like I want to take all the credit. I had to do that, but no, I have really good friends and I have a good partnership. Um, I'm not as afraid of doing something new and different because I'm not as afraid of failure. And one of the reasons I'm not afraid of failure is because of this safety net and the support of friends and family. So don't go through the world alone. Like, and you don't need a whole lot of friends. Some people have lots and lots. Some people just have a few. But yeah, you need that. And there's you learn about yourself, and you also have the opportunity to be there for somebody else. You also learn what kind of a person you are for another. You have this opportunity to be compassionate, to be a good listener, to be supportive to somebody else. So that's also really important.
The point about the comfort zone thing, I've noticed that you cannot do more. It's good to look back and think, oh, wait, I would have probably done that on my own. But if you were going a certain way and then there was a fork in the road somewhat related to a person, it probably was not going to happen without that person in that way. They have a big influence on your default. We can look at our default over time and we have a certain trajectory. And then if there was any sort of shock or alteration to it, that person probably had a substantial impact on you trying out that thing, or you becoming more bold or more structured in life, or something that you would not have done prior. People have a big impact on our what we see of ourselves
Mm-hmm.
over time. There's a shift. Now, my last question to keep things of a manner of organization is the well in philosophy of love and sex, that's the knowledge of it, the understanding of it. What what would you like students to take away from the class, or is it an understanding of where they can connect with these things? What's the thing you want them to take away from learnings in that class?
Yeah, I I think that our ideas about love. Somebody might hear something like, well, philosophy class on love, or that's so silly, or that's just for the poets, or maybe that's a psychology class. What's philosophy got to do with it? But a lot of our laws and our cultural attitudes do reflect ideas about love, about who is allowed to love and in what way, in what capacity, for how long. There's a lot that's expressed in the law and culture about what you can and cannot do. And a lot of that is being challenged. So I think it's difficult because it's so serious. It can cost somebody their life. It's so serious. And so this subject that I thought would be kind of fun to look into and kind of fun to teach, the seriousness of it has really hit me. And the way that it's made its way into like the top echelon of political conversations or debates are really questions that hinge on the notion of who is allowed to love and in what capacity. And so it's important for us to go back and to take a look at where do these ideas come from. So I never, with my students, want for them to walk out, let's say, it's not that I want them, what I want them to walk out with is the information. What is the best literature out there that is exploring the ideas that we've thought were the foundation for a very long time? And I invite my students to investigate that in such a way where they could reject the literature from the class and say, no, the way that it's been is the best. They can do that. Or they can explore ways in which maybe things are shifting and what is the significance of that. So what I really want for my students to have is the capacity to just see what has been an assumption, versus different ways of looking at the question about what constitutes love. And if it was an important enough question for Plato, then we can certainly sit down and think about it. Because Plato's book, The Symposium, is, you've got like 6, 7 drunk men, and they all decide to stand up at a party and give a speech on love. And I think that Plato had them all drunk for a reason, because Plato himself knew that if we were to just sit down and come up with some sort of a critical thinking, logical argument defining love, it would be missing something. And even if I were to say to the students, hey, what is love? And somebody just Wikipedia's it, that's not going to be satisfying. Or if I just say, here's Shakespeare's sonnets, now that's what love is, that also wouldn't be satisfying. So one of the interesting things about love is that it's a very big deal because it's an underscoring, motivating factor for your relationships, why you get out of bed, why you care about anything at all. Why are you going to be creative? Why are you going to speak this way with your friend, with your child? How are you going to treat your pets? Like, everything is actually through this vessel of how we're relating and the degrees to which we care and how we're allowed to. So it's not a small topic at all. To imagine life without it would be frightening. We'd all be psychopaths if we didn't have it. So I want for them to get out of, I'm not trying to answer any question for them. I want them to appreciate the complexity of the question. What is sex and love, and what are the assumptions?
They are highly important and very connected to our well-being and even our existence. Take them away and you would have a very lacking existence of sorts.
Mm-hmm.
For this discussion, I would like to thank you for having joined, describing a bit from philosophy, various topics, and informing us in relation to love and relationships. And even we got in a little bit about podcasting. Professor Gwendolyn Dolske.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And we are out.